So as far as the updated agenda that I sent to everybody, so I did this the last thing before I went to sleep, although I didn't mail it until this morning. The idea being I was going to proofread it, but having done that, let me give you a few other proofs here just so that we can not be confused. It's all next steps. I somehow just I put in lots of Roman numerals, just ignore that. It's all next steps, A through, whatever. And then the other thing is in the very end, I talk about formal action. And I talk about discussion at the July working meeting and adoption at the July working meeting. The second one is the public meeting. So just know that going forward. So here's what we've got. So obviously the plan for this is a little backwards because the idea was to have had a working meeting last week where we would have had a lot of feedback from the board to bring to this meeting to move further, both in our document and with that information, talk further about our plan. And I thought even about trying to cancel this meeting, but it just didn't seem to make sense. So here we are. And what I've got here is sort of a set of next steps. The first is what more we want to know. I have this down here for about 20 minutes to about 2:25. And then the next one, further our discussions are just a statement. Then part C, further bringing the debate to the public to sort of talk about how we're going to bring this out to the public, and then the formal action. So that's the plan. I'm getting a lot of feedback. Are other people? No, okay. I'll just ignore it then. All right. So starting with what more we want to know, the sort of the different ways we have to get information is through public meetings and bringing in speakers. So I want to say something about the public meeting in June, talk about other speakers, and then we've been developing a set of pending questions. So we should continue to add if we want. And then I think Alex and Sandra also have some responses, some answers to us. So for next week, what we did is we re-invited the people from last time who couldn't come. And insofar as we could, if someone couldn't come and they were on a specific subject and we wanted a substitute, we tried to bring a substitute. So the current plan is we re-invited Kristen Harper, who can't come. I think she had a death in the family, and I think it must have been a serious one. Constance Lindsay has said she is going to come, so we have her coming. And John Supovitz is coming, which is instead of what was originally Doug Connect and then the person from Nebraska. Emily, you want to say a minute about him? Why we're having him, what he can speak to? Sounded very interesting. You're on mute. You're on mute.
John Supovitz is, full disclosure, he was my dissertation, what do you call it? Advisor. Thank you. It's been a while. And he is the director of CPRE at Penn, which is the Center for Education Research and Policy. And
education.
Yes. And he focuses mostly on sort of large scale accountability and looking at what actually leads to change. So what practices within districts around accountability actually leads to better outcomes in schools. So pretty relevant. I think the most relevant, I'll share an article. Actually, I can probably share it here in the chat if you like, or yeah, is about leading indicators. And I think it speaks directly to the work we're doing. So.
So Emily? I'm open if anybody has other suggestions for next week, just because we could probably fit another person or two if we wanted to. I think we also have other things. We have plenty on the agenda, but if we wanted to add somebody, we could think of doing that.
So Ruth, I had a quick question or response to Emily. This is Jack.
Oh, hi, Jack. I'm sorry. And see.
That's okay. Emily mentioned that it's relevant at the moment, her suggested speaker, and I just want to kind of level set for a second. If the scoring for accountability is off the table for another year because of COVID and everybody being gone, and the state assessments not being given, and the possibility that that could be again next year, are we really spending our time best working on accountability measures and having that discussion? And should we instead be looking at other supports now we could be giving students in schools and teachers around distance learning and around other things that are incredibly pressing at this super difficult time to be a teacher and a learner?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, Jack. And I think you're reminding me to get back to John and just ask him to speak to this context. I mean, I think he probably would anyway. Yeah, but I think it's important for us probably to make that clear to the folks we're hearing from, that I do see this as a time to not just to think about what we have been doing, but what we could be doing differently now, and then when things return supposedly to whatever normal looks like, right? When we return to something more normal or more. So I guess my response would be, I agree that there are things that are more pressing, but I think we still are going to want to assess what we are doing, right? Whatever that ends up being. And I think we can ask people who think about this a lot, who think about accountability a lot and know what the tools that exist are, what their take is on it. And I think he's a good person to do that. If that makes sense.
Also, Jack, let me just also level set in a different way, which is, regardless, I mean, I agree, if there's a way we could figure out how to have some impact and be helpful on the distance learning and so on, we should do that. We've tried to do it in a couple of ways, and I'm all for doing more. But the issue of the rating, it is current, because insofar as we're going to get any changes in the rating, in the way that is formulated, OSSE would need to make those proposals by next spring for December 2021. And
So in a year and a half.
We have is very much based
in a year and a half.
What?
So in a year and a half.
No, in a
December 2021, a year and a half from now.
Right.
Doing the math wrong?
If we want to have changes in the December 2021 rating, OSSE would need to make those proposals to the Department of Ed in spring, I think March, if the deadlines say the same, of 2021. So the idea is to get something to OSSE early enough in the fall that there's an opportunity for them to think about that, formulate it, possibly work with us, and make those proposals in the spring. Right. So that this
I've read your calendar that you sent out about that, and it makes perfect sense. But going back to Emily, I appreciate you having that conversation with the witness. I think that would be very helpful to put it into context of this global pandemic and this period of really difficult distance learning that we're in right now, and how we can have accountability measures for teachers in schools and systems when assessments are off the table at the moment. So thank you, Emily.
And one thing we could do, Jack, in terms of the next meeting is also think if there's someone to bring to talk about that topic. How do you deal with accountability when there's no testing, which I do think is a reasonable. It's an important question. We raised it actually. John Poe and Marcus and I talked to Hanso about it at our last meeting with her on Monday, at our monthly meeting. And their inclination at that point was, schools and LEAs are going to do their own thing on it. And I agree with you. It's an issue.
Did we get a readout of that meeting on Monday? I don't think I saw it in my email.
No, and we have not typically done.
Could we do that at some point?
Sure.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
John Paul, Jessica?
Yeah, I just want to jump in because I agree with Jack, and I know I raised this to you in our conversation about this work on Essa. I want to add just 2 more points to it. One is I'm speaking at ANC meetings over the next couple of weeks, and I just got the advanced questions from an ANC for a meeting tomorrow night. And I'll note that there are lots of questions about distance learning and lots of questions about the current moment and none about the accountability system. So just what it looks like to the public that we're going to spend June, and it looks like from your detailed agenda, maybe July's meeting also focused on the accountability system. We may want to reconsider how many meetings in a row we spend on the accountability system when there are lots of questions from the public about distance learning. And then the second thing is, on that point you raise about what other states are doing. I did a little looking into it. I have had some conversations with folks from CCSSO and Chiefs for Change. One of my colleagues on a project for a client is a former state assistant superintendent. Like, she just left the job in December. And all of them are like, nobody knows what to do yet because we don't know what next year looks like yet. And so I think it's a great idea to see what other states are doing, but I think right now lots of states are in the place we are, which is this is kind of a time when everyone's focused on the immediate, not on revisions to accountability systems because of the real weight of the immediate in the lives of everybody, teachers, students, families, administrators, et cetera.
Yeah, and I agree to some degree with Jessica. We can walk and chew gum at the same time, right? But right now we've been chewing gum for a year and a half, and we're going to continue to chew gum for a year and a half. And you know, I don't want the board to seem tone deaf or out of touch or obsessed with an accountability system when we've got other things that are happening in the education space in our city that we're frankly ignoring.
So I'll just say I don't feel like we're ignoring them. I think we've talked a lot about them. We did a COVID session in the last couple of times. We're working with Aussie on some SPED things. I am, as I said, I'm very happy to take up other things. And Jack, if you have some ideas about ways we could be effective on this, not just sort of talk, but have some way of being effective on it, I'm all ears, but I don't want to use the rest of the time at this meeting to do it. So you could raise it tonight under new business. We could talk offline. There's any number of ways to do it, but I want to move this forward on what we've got for now.
So the research committee is going to just continue to work on the star rating system.
Well, it is what we agreed to work on, and I don't, we made it a priority a while ago, and the reality is that if we don't do something about it, we're still going to be having it in the future, and that's what a majority of the board decided it wanted to rethink. So here we are.
I will also just say, I mean, this is directly in our view, and it's something we are expected to do, and to, you know, provide recommendations to ASI at various points along the way. And I guess I would just say my take is on doing it now is a little different, I guess. I'm seeing it as again as an opportunity rather than as being tone deaf. This is a time when we can think about, wow, what do indicators look like now? Like, what are the indicators? Can they be responsive rather than, you know, benchmarks that we're moving towards, right? Is this a time where we have, you know, a transitional accountability system that's maybe less accountability and more sort of assessment, gathering information about what is working, what isn't working? Because as everybody is noting, whatever we go back to is not going to be the normal that we had before, right? And so are there going to be practices that, you know, we've assessed to be more effective than others, right? And I think that is the kind of thing that makes sense to me. I'm excited to talk about it, actually.
Yeah, and that does too. The way you frame that, Emily, is super helpful to me and seems very responsible and very forward thinking. And so if we can frame our conversations around that and and really delve into that, I think the framing is super important, and it just can't. I agree with you, Emily.
So maybe Emily will break that up. I mean, I take it as sort of changing how we think about what's important in terms of our accountability system, but maybe Emily can write it up better. And I agree. I mean, insofar as we're thinking about how to shift, we're thinking about how to shift. And it's an important time to be thinking about it. Should we go into questions that we have? Okay, so then what I'm going to ask is, we did have a set of questions around what was allowed under Essa, and we had a set of questions around climate. So I'm going to ask first Alex and then Sandra, I think, just to give us a little update on what we know about that.
Yeah, hold on 1 second. Sorry, let me just pull up the document. So first, I'll just say that I am on phone duty for the office today, so if the phone rings, that's why I've been stepping away. The document that I shared with everybody this morning answers some of what I'm calling kind of our perennial Essa questions related to what the Essa accountability law says. And so whether or not folks have had the opportunity to review it yet is okay. It's kind of just a draft document where I've been gathering kind of thoughts and findings. And so the 4 questions that I think are consistently asked amongst this committee, amongst the state board, are: 1, does Essa require a summative rating be published annually for each school? So that's kind of the first big question that is always asked. And so we wanted to just do some digging into this and go back to the statute and the regulatory authorities and kind of see what it actually says. And so just for the record, Essa does not require a summative rating. So the answer is no. Ratings are not a required element of the Essa statute. However, and this is something that I think we've said before, Essa does require states to develop these accountability systems. In the District of Columbia, that's the STAR framework, that allow for what Essa describes as meaningful differentiation and the identification of the bottom 5% of schools. And of important note is that the bottom 5% of schools, kind of the methodology and who those schools are and how they rank is required to be publicly reported. And so given all of that, no, a summative rating is not required, but states are required to develop these accountability systems that essentially create summative ratings.
For the bottom 5%, I'm understanding you.
Correct. But in order to identify the bottom 5%, you do need to rank every single school.
So can I ask a question there, Alex?
Correct. Yeah, go ahead, Jessica.
So in theory, what that means is that a state could rank every school and only disclose the bottom 5%.
That is correct. And there are some states that have chosen to do that. And so in California, for example, you will, the designations that they use are ones that align more closely to targeted support, comprehensive support, and identification of those schools, because it is required by Essa and the statute that those schools are publicly identified. And here's the complicated thing. To identify the lowest 5% of performing schools, you will need to rank every single school to figure out who the bottom performers are. And so his interpretation of this, and also I was not aware of this actually, but I think originally the regulatory authority that provided guidance for the statute did explicitly state that a summative rating was required, and that was back in 2017. That has since been, from my understanding, overturned actually under the current Trump administration and the I don't know which act it was, but basically I think the one that, you know, for every new regulation, another one needs to be taken away type thing. But to get to some of the things that Aussie's thinking is, you know, so we do have to rank the schools. If we just publish the bottom 5% and that information, you know, what is also going to prevent folks from creating their own ranking systems with their own narratives across the board too. And so I think Aussie's real thinking was, you know, you're creating a centralized one ranking system coming from the SCA. But yeah.
Yeah, I think that is super helpful, Alex, because in my head, I think, so we could only publish the bottom 5% with rankings, but that wouldn't be very transparent because we'd be hiding 95% of schools' ranking and only calling out the lowest performers. And that seems less publicly transparent to me.
Correct. And some things, and you know, this is my own thinking, you know, say you are, you know, not in the bottom 5% of schools, but say you're the, you know, the 11th school on the list, right? And you're just above 5%, but you would never publicly truly know, and nor would other folks know that you're also a, you know, a poor performing school that might need additional supports, you know, equitable supports to pull you up. And so I think there's a lot of things to toy with here, but really the purpose of digging into this non-summative rating question was to throw it out there. No, summative ratings are not a requirement of the Essa statute, but there are some requirements that essentially create ranking systems that are really what is publicly disclosed. And so,
Sorry,
go ahead, Ruth, I'm sorry.
No, it's Emily.
Oh,
Can
sorry.
you say again what you said about, before you said Aussie has created a sort of standard rating system, you were saying that is to counteract the possibility of states creating their own rating. Can you explain that again? What the...
Yeah, so I think some of Aussie's thinking on, you know, providing this information is, I believe, in an attempt, if you will, to make sure that the information is coming from kind of one state level source as opposed to different, you know, whether it's nonprofit organizations, other interest groups developing kind of, they may have their own agendas for probably not the best words usage. Because the information still needs to be put out there, right? And anybody, and I think to this date, really, anybody could do their own analysis of the data that is publicly accessible in the state's report card or in any other state's accountability system, and kind of create their own rankings. And I know some groups in the district have already done that and created their own tiers. You know, if you look at like Empower K-12 that has their bold performance schools, they have their own methodology for identifying, you know, schools that they feel like are, you know, moving the needle for students. And so, you know, whether or not that's a deliberate attempt to minimize the number of additional ranking systems in the district, you know, I think that's kind of just one thought process that we could think about. Or that
can I just clarify? So even if you don't rank schools, I mean, this is what we keep going back and forth on, I think, is even if you don't have the stars, you still have the test scores on. Like if you have a dashboard, you can still see that this school, the kids scored, that their student test scores are low and it's disaggregated, and right. So it's not like it's not transparent. It's just not, you can't glance at it and see it.
That is correct, Emily.
It doesn't take that long to look at the scores. So anyway.
Emily, I think what I'm getting at is that in order to create the bottom 5% of schools on all the required data, it's not just test scores. It's the algorithm that says test scores plus attendance plus retention plus whatever. So there's a formula. And if we only publish the bottom 5% of schools and put everybody else's data just publicly in a dashboard, we would only call out the bottom 5 in order. And everybody else would be sort of disguised behind, I suppose I could crunch the formula on my own if I was talented with Excel, but otherwise we wouldn't have the formula.
It also doesn't have to be by a formula either. It could be very simple. I mean, if you're just identifying the bottom 5%, you could identify them based on proficiency.
No, that's my understanding, is that it cannot be, that we have to have some sort of formula by which we rate the bottom 5. Am I misunderstanding that, Alex?
So you're understanding this correctly, Jessica.
So you have to have, how many factors you have to include?
So I guess that will get to kind of some of the other questions in this document,
Yeah.
but there are essentially 5 indicators that must be used in the statewide accountability plan. And I think we've talked about that before. You know, 1 is academic achievement as measured by proficiency on a state's annual assessment. 2 is a measure of student growth. 3 is related to high school graduation rates. 4 is related to English language level proficiency. And then the 5th indicator is essentially an indicator of school quality or student success that the state is able to choose on their own. And that could be something like a school climate and safety survey. It could be post-secondary readiness. It could be completion of AP, SAT coursework. And that fifth indicator is oftentimes, by many states' standards, quite a lengthy list of indicators. It's not just one indicator. And really what needs to happen is those first 4 indicators, so proficiency, growth, graduation rates, and ELL performance, have to make up the majority of the rating, or the majority, they have to be the largest weight in the aggregate. And so, yes, proficiency, among other things, needs to be included when developing the state accountability system.
So when in identifying the bottom 5%, you have to use all of this.
Correct. You would have to use all of those.
This is Jack. Could I go back to a point that Emily raised just a moment ago, which was a dashboard that would perhaps have all of the schools' proficiency ratings, right? But you'd have to look at each individual school. My first 5 years on the board, the big problem that Aussie had, and Alex hit on it for a moment. He said, yeah, if you're really proficient in Excel, you can figure that out. The real problem that we had the first 5 years I was on the board was Aussie provided all of this data in big Excel spreadsheets, and it was only people who were advanced enough and knowledgeable enough could go through and see how each individual school was doing and how it was doing versus its peer schools. And that was a huge problem, huge, brought up tons of times before the board. And this was a way to get rid of those old style spreadsheets that wouldn't have a summative rating, but would allow people to look at each school individually. And it's just really hard for parents to do that. And parents came to us and asked us to help fix that problem. So that's some historical context for that.
Just one point on that, Jack. That was before we had report cards. So I do think there is a difference at what's being talked about in terms of a dashboard is parents wouldn't have to go back to spreadsheets. It would be on the report card. So I hear your point, but I just think there's also a different context at the moment.
And they just have to look at all 200 schools scores to see how each of them is ranked.
You'd pick out a few. So one thing I don't know if Alex or Sandra has it today, but we were going to try to look at a few examples of how districts do it. But they pick out a few. And you can look at them. You don't have all 200.
And also just, I think another thing that really needs to be clarified is, so, you know, when we talk about Essa, there are the school report cards, and then there's the accountability system. They are not one and the same. And I think, you know, sometimes I'm probably guilty of this too, is that we kind of throw around the terms as if they're the same thing, but they are not. The school report cards are essentially what is the DC school report card system. STAR framework is the accountability system that is a component that's plugged into the DC school report card. And so they are not one and the same. And I think, you know, as we're talking about this, we just have to continue to be cognizant of that, and that we're not equating the accountability system to the school report card, or the school report card to the accountability system.
Just to further clarify, what I was getting at was the fact that there is a school report card means that now if there was a dashboard, just as there is a rating, it would be right there in a simple to find place.
And I would just say, you know, again, thinking about how we might think differently about our culture, right? The culture around assessing schools. That if we're thinking about them as calling them out, like we're calling out the bottom 5, then I agree, like we wouldn't want to do that, right? And then have the others sort of hidden. But I think if we're framing it more as we are making sure that we know which schools need the most support. And it doesn't have to just be 5%, right? Like that is the minimum. But we could expand that, right? And we could say, this is the percentage of schools that scored below whatever. Like we could make that decision that we have our own bar, that these are the schools that they need the most help for this reason, right? Based on this data. And it's really focused more on support in our language even. Then it wouldn't be as much an issue of like calling out those bottom 5%. It's more, these are the schools that we know we need to give targeted support to. And it might not just be based on PARCC scores, right? It might be these schools need help with their academic performance. These schools need help with, you know, their parent engagement. And depending on what indicators we end up highlighting, right? I say end up as if we're really going to change it, but you know what I mean.
I'm just going to jump in because this is relevant to the article I shared yesterday with folks, the Polikoff and Hutt piece. So one thing that Emily said, I wholeheartedly agree with, that if we believe that a system of accountability is neatly linked to school improvement, all of what Emily said makes sense. Their paper challenges that assumption. Their paper basically says, you can put things out there publicly, and there are some public benefits, and there are some ways you can put things out there publicly that have private benefits. But what they are not finding in this culture of public accountability is that there isn't a neat linkage between the public of the notion of data being transparent to the public and the ability to make improvements. And so for that, you need to put in place other policy mechanisms like school improvement reviews or clear linkages between schools that perform in the bottom 5% must take the following kind of actions using state-approved tools or processes or programs. And all of those would be true with the current system as it would be with any system. And so that was why that article held such appeal for me, because I think going back to the point I know Ruth is getting tired of me harping on about what's the purpose of us reviewing this in the first place?
I'm not tired of it at all. I'm not tired of it at all.
If we're trying to review it in order to make more perfect a tool that leads to better school improvement, this new piece of research suggests that like we're barking up the wrong tree. And there are other ways we could be working to influence true school improvement opportunities. If we're changing it because there's a ideological divide between rating schools and providing public information, that's another story. But I don't think we know what to do until we've come to a place of why we're doing it.
So let me just intervene on one thing. One, I'm sorry Zach's not here because part of what he's really been trying to push, and I think it's very important and useful, is how to think about this in terms of what are we going to report and how does it connect to the school improvement. I mean, I think part of the issue here is we have, in theory, a role around the rating, and we weren't given a role on the improvement part. So it's a problem. I mean, I think we all understand that it's a problem. If we were all in charge of school improvement, we'd go about all of this in a very different way, and we'd go about it in a different way if we were starting from scratch. Part of the problem is, one, we don't have that role, and is there a way that we can leverage our involvement in this as a way to identify more of a role, or to push OSSI to play that role more, to provide the kind of supports that are needed? And sort of on the flip side of that, since it's not being used, I think most of us would say, since it's not being used really to support and help schools the way we might hope, then the fact that it has these downsides that we've been hearing about becomes a bigger issue. And so that, it seems to me that part of what we're trying, those are some of the dilemmas that we're trying to balance here. How can we either connect these to something useful? And Jessica, one of the things that you would put in the document at one point was the issue of inspections. I mean, I think it's totally fascinating that the charter's PCSB uses the inspection process. I think it's a fact. I mean, I think there's a lot of possibility there. So I don't rule that out at all.
But PCSB also rates at schools, tier 1 through 3, and it uses an inspection process. I think for me, Ruth, one thing you said that is notable is we don't have control over that. We do have control over this. So let's stay here. And I will say that speaks to me in a way that I don't like it. I'll be honest. I'm like, I don't want us to make changes to the accountability system simply because that's the thing we have power over. I think that would be a bad reason for us to spend this much time and energy, because it's the place we have the control versus seeking to influence things we think could really make a difference for schools and communities.
Well, can I just say this? I also think it's important to just underscore the fact that when we passed the framework 3 years ago, right, I think everybody, right, whether you voted for it or didn't, whether you, right, supported it in its current form or thought we should have done more, everybody pretty much universally agreed that it was imperfect, and that the state board was going to commit time to commit time over the years to making sure that we made the framework more perfect. Now, whether that's, right, a conversation about how we get more growth, or how we do these access to opportunities, or about whether it should be stars or letters or numbers, right? I think all of those are part of that conversation. But we committed as a board, right, to making this an ongoing conversation, because we knew, one, I think because we all agreed that the framework was imperfect, and that two, the state board could really was really the best place to open up that continued dialogue about how we improve, which is why, right, we set up a committee after we passed the framework to continue the work, which is why, right, we moved that work into this committee to continue having those conversations. And that even though there's some work on the superintendent side that'll be delayed or stymied, I do agree with the position that, right, it's a part of the work that the board committed to, and that all of us agree that it's imperfect and that we should work to make it more perfect now. And those aren't going to be easy conversations, right? The conversation we had to get to where we are was probably more knock down, drag out than these are. But it's a worthwhile conversation to have, and whether, right. And I appreciate that point, Jessica. I'm going to read the full thing, but yeah, I think if it means, right, more wholesale changes, or it means more incremental ones, I think clearly we've got to decide that, right, as a group, as a committee, as a body. But I think we shouldn't take any of those things off the table just for the sake of saying we've been there already, you know.
I guess that's what I'm saying, though, Marcus. Like, and I'll say it plainly. There are people on our board who do not like rating schools. I think we are reviewing STAR because those people believe they have the votes to remove a school rating. If that were plain up front, if people said, I hate the rating, I think we should review STAR because I want to get rid of the rating, I would feel like I trusted what we were really about here. But I feel like we're coming at it all sorts of back ways and sideways to try to avoid saying that. And I think that's what this is about.
I'm so glad you said that, Jessica. I really am. I'm glad you came out and said that, because I always feel when I speak that I'm being accused of something underhanded. And just because I hold a view And you're right, I don't like the rating, but it doesn't mean that I am here because I think I can just change it. I wouldn't go through all of this if I please believe me when I say that I so value your eruditeness. I don't know if that's a word, but you know what I mean.
Erudition.
Erudition, thank you. That was.
I actually don't know what erudition means. So look at me.
No, yeah, I'm looking it up now.
I don't know what it means. I'm okay admitting that.
No, but you know what I mean. I think that.
I don't, but I mean, it sounds like you're trying, it sounds like a compliment, but I don't know what it means.
That's what I'm saying is that I think these conversations are incredibly important and valuable. And I'm really glad that there aren't only people that I agree with on the state board. And I think that that is vital. So I really hope going forward that when I put my view forward that seems like it's, on some side of things, that you don't think I'm just putting it forward because I think we have the votes and screw you. I really am not thinking that. I'm thinking that these conversations are super important. And I think there's something in the form and function of what we're doing, in that I think strong accountability is accountability where you are constantly revisiting what it is you're doing, where you're looking at what other states are doing, where you're looking at what the research has said and what it is saying now, right? And I don't think we're wasting our time by doing this, because I think it's an important role that we play, right? OSCE doesn't have time to do this. We've been charged to do this. And I think it's true we're in a crisis, but these things still need to be done. I think they need to be done within the context of the crisis, but also thinking beyond it. We are going to get out of this at some point. And this is not something, when we make recommendations, if we want them to be actionable, then we need to think about timing, and I would just push back on the questioning of doing this at all. I think we should always be revisiting what we are doing. Otherwise, it becomes static and stagnant and maybe not relevant anymore, is what I'd say. And I will just say, as somebody who worked in a school where we did have school quality review, I found it was an incredibly useful process. It was formative, but it was also an accountability system. And this was part of the process, right? It was like self-reflecting, looking at the practices that are in place, constantly questioning them, having these long conversations. They're worthwhile because that's how you get better.
But I'd also say operating right in the structure that we do, that right, no matter what, no matter kind of the composition of the board in general, right, there are still structural things that will make any revisions to this structurally difficult from our end if we're the only ones with the will to do it. So, I think, for sure, our makeup as a board has changed, but I think it's changed on both ends. But I think, again, my main motivation was that we committed as a board to make this more perfect. And as somebody who voted against it originally because I thought it had deep imperfections, I'm leaning into this conversation because I'm excited about doing that work. And I think it's necessary work. And at the end of this, if we're able to make this accountability system even an inch better, where it gives families, a better view of what school quality is, I think that's progress on our part, and think it's a worthwhile endeavor for the board.
And I also just want to respond to it. It's I don't like the rating. I don't think I've been untransparent about that, but I also very much regard this as a negotiation, as a process, as a discussion. And my goal is to try to find ways in here that that can work. And I hope you'll do the same thing, is sort of try to find some ways that we can fix this, understanding the kinds of problems that exist in this rating system. And I think people have raised some very serious issues about some of the bias that comes through in the ratings, about what happens to schools when they get misrated. Anyway, so yeah, you can say that. I mean, I'm pretty clear about that, but it's not the only outcome that I can live with. You know, we'll see. The other thing I do want to say, because I just want to be clear about it, is what I said earlier was, yeah, I think we have some authority in this area. I didn't say because we have authority, therefore do something. I said, because it's a place where we have authority and there is a lot to do, it makes sense to put time here as opposed to somewhere else that needs attention where our authority is lesser. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Well, if I could, I really appreciate Jessica's openness in this is hard conversation, right? Let's put aside the actual substance of this. It's really hard to have a conversation with folks when we're presuming motive, and that's really hard. And once you sort of get a reputation one way or another, people assume immediately that you're either going to be for or against something. That's human nature. What I want to make sure, and Emily, I think you're entirely right that we have to have these conversations. And Marcus, yes, we can always be improving all of our systems, absolutely, and we should always be fighting, even if it's just for an inch, to do that. My concern, when we make these presumptions, we're not the only people making presumptions about what our colleagues are doing. There are also a superintendent, a chancellor, a deputy mayor for education, and 13 council members that are presuming, or 12 at the moment, 13 after next week. There are also other policy leaders in the city who are presuming motive. And what I'd really hate to do is go through all this work and spend all of this time and all of this effort, and then have OSSI just go to council and go around us again like they did 3 months ago with the COVID legislation, because they're presuming that we wouldn't be good players. And so these are tough conversations. I'm glad we're having them. I think there's a political conversation to be had as well as a policy conversation at some point.
Yeah, and I think I agree with you, Jack. And I think, you know, as much as possible, right, the members of this group have to hold that center and control that narrative as well, right? And so I think it's important, to your point, Jack, that we're having conversations like this and that we really come with a consensus about how we present our work to the public. I think that's really important, and to our partners, that's exceptionally important. And so as much as we can be in line with one another about you know, why we're doing this work, no matter, right, our disagreements about where that work should end and what, you know, but that the intent behind the work is a cohesive message, I think is really important. So no, I appreciate that.
Yeah, it is. And thank you, Marcus. And I think, like I said at the beginning of this conversation today, Emily's framing of, you know, witnesses and information gathering as what are some other accountability measures that work, and what are some others that are leading indicators that can be really helpful. I think just framing our work around this as, yeah, some of the things are working, some of them aren't, and some of them we just can't do right now because we aren't having statewide assessments. So framing it as, this is the next evolution of what assessments look like under COVID or under lockdown or under whatever, and we take the best of that and move it forward. I think that's a much more helpful context for us to be operating in than a document that I saw last week that did not have any mention of anything that was working right in the current system and only nitpicked what opinions were of what was bad in the system. I think we need to identify what is working well, improve what we can, and change what needs to be changed. That's where I'm coming from.
Okay, I'm going to propose that we move on. I think that, you know, maybe, well, one thing to discuss, and maybe we do it at a separate point, is what do people think is working well? I mean, I think that is something that we should put into our document And there was a section on it, didn't get added, so I sort of collapsed it, but I'm happy to add it about what people think the strengths are. But I will say, Jack, I mean, I depend on the whole committee. And when we put together the initial document, part of what I said is, all I could put in there was what I was taking from the meetings, what made sense to me. I didn't want to a very large extent, write for other people. To some extent I did, to get people to sort of comment, but I need people to sort of put their stuff in there.
And I've tried it several times in the past and have been rebuffed. Not necessarily this document in particular, but in other instances. And I'm not willing to sacrifice additional time and energy and talent, because I do have a good deal of talent in public policy. I've been doing it for 20 years, my job. And when that isn't appreciated and respected, then I'm not going to reinvest in that.
Okay. Well, like you said, it wasn't on this one, but okay. So should we talk, I'm just trying to think, we can talk a little bit about climate, or we can talk about bringing the discussion to the public, and how we want to do that, which flows, I think, very much from what Marcus was talking about how we take some of these issues and present them to the public in a way where there can be a discussion about them that in turn then comes back to us. I mean, the way I'm seeing this is that we would sort of identify, we'd have a document or a resolution that would sort of say, look, here are some things, some issues that we think are problems, some strengths that exist, how, and some questions. And ask people to discuss them, and maybe we'd have some recommendations. Here are some things that we've come up with that might advance and improve what we're now doing, and then move that out into sort of adopt that and then move that out into word conversations, which I know we were all interested in having, and then from there come back in the fall for a maybe invite have a general public meeting where people could talk about it, and then adopt something and try to work with Aussie to move it into a next place. Anybody? I'm not hearing anything.
Can you say the very last point again? Sorry.
I'm sorry. I think I lost everybody. So I don't know.
Can you hear me, Ruth?
I can hear you now.
I think nobody was speaking. But can you just say your question again? Sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just sort of posing based on the piece of paper, sort of how we would sort of push this out.
Wait, push what out?
How we would try to develop this into a document that would then go into ward meetings. So what I laid out on here is that we'd have sort of a document that would try to sort of capture, as Jack was saying, some of the strengths, some of the questions, some of the issues, ideas about improvement, sort of try to pull together both where we had consensus and questions that we wanted to pose, dilemmas that we wanted to pose, and then adopt that and then use that as a way to sort of organize ward discussions, and then go from there. So that would be, so we adopt something in July, have ward discussions, and then in September have perhaps invite the public to come testify, and then in October adopt something. So that's what I'm sort of putting down here as sort of a timeline. So I'm just putting that up for.
Ruth, I have a question about what we would bring to adopt and what we would bring to the public. I shared with you when we spoke last week, the document that we have now is rather long. And so I think what we need to bring either for an adoption or to have a coherent package of things to share with the public and get reactions to, we probably need to come up with something, one, more concise, and two, with some clear guiding questions on where we see the opportunity for changes. Perhaps, and I don't know how we do this diplomatically, is not always my strength, but how we bring to the public a realistic conception of where OSSI is likely to make change. Because what I don't want to do is set up an antagonistic process in public that says, here are all the things we'd like to change, knowing that OSSI's expectations about change are different. So if there's a diplomatic way to say, here are things the state board is interested in, here are things we've heard from OSSI that they are interested in, what are you, the public, interested in? And it could be like a choose some from column A, some from column B, and or create your own. But I think we've probably got to set something more concise and something that has a little bit of a template so that we can each go to our respective wards and have some consistency and fidelity of what questions we ask, what feedback we seek, so that we can share it together in a common template. That's my thinking right now.
Yeah, and I think to piggyback on that, I think it's also very easy to frame like here's what right like here's what OSSI's committed to do already, right? And I think you were saying some of that, like some of these are, I'm sure like in conversations there have been conceptual thoughts on OSSI's side, but there are also like firm commitments on some of the things that they've said. So like, as we say, we're gonna, lean into this, and these are the things we're expecting to work pretty concretely on with OSSI. But as we revisit this work, these are also some of the broader questions we're thinking about. I think that's a good point. Yeah, exactly.
So what, I'm sorry, wait, say, I'm just seeing that this is going in the chat.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Jessica just said like those things that OSSI committed to, like high school growth and then exploring school climate, right? Those are things that conversations we can lean in on, and then also spelling out kind of some of the broader questions that we had that kind of fall outside of that, but that, we're saying we want to explore with members of the community as a part of that work.
Right, and to Jack's point, maybe adding something about current context.
All right. One, just to go back to Jessica's question, because I think this is a good one also. I mean, I'm for trying to figure out how to have a document, a public discussion about what's a better way, what's the way to make this a better system. I'm not sure that I want to start by constraining it as to what OSSI is interested in. I mean, we don't know, and they're not necessarily saying anyway. But it's, to me, to go back to this, to Jack's point, it's a political question. It is a political question, and in a lot of places, there's a lot of political interest in something different, and I don't necessarily want to be totally constrained prior. Look, in the end, there's a system. In the end, that's absolutely true, but it doesn't mean we can't raise the conversation. Sort of how I.
Yeah, no, but yeah, not necessarily saying like these are the only things we're going to focus on, but saying, these are the things that, right, like in the general interest of saying we need to improve the system, right? OSSI has said that they're going to focus on these things to bring back to the board. And while we're looking forward to engaging in those conversations, and those will be conversations we're thinking about as well, that these are also broader things that we as members of the board, the community at large, have brought to us, and we'll also begin exploring those things as a part of that work. So not framing it as in this is what OSSI's doing, so this is what we're focusing on, but saying that, right, I think, right, politically, right, saying that there's a broad overture, right, that what we have now is imperfect, and that everybody in their various ways are leaning into this conversation, and we're looking and we're going to work on that. What OSSI is already committed to do, in addition to bringing in the voices who also have other ideas around that.
I'll just say, Ruth, I think my interest is in making sure that, to the point Emily made about, we come to this work with different lenses, and while, being open to being changed is a really good norm, I don't want us to have 8 or 9 very different meetings in the wards so that when we come back, we have a difficult time comparing information.
You know,
Do you
I
know what I mean? Like
totally,
the
I
outcomes of
totally
the
agree with that.
conversations may be different. I just hope that the agenda for starting the conversations would be common.
I totally agree with that. That's what I'm hoping to get to, is sort of a common set of questions, a common set of dilemmas, and I hope maybe a common set of, hey, maybe these are alternatives that would get us somewhere, so that we're collecting input along a common template. I totally agree with that.
Could we make it look nice so that people are attracted to it and can be read easily? Can staff work on that?
Well, that's the goal. We don't yet have the content. But along those lines, what we talked about it in social studies, what I hope we could have, and we've already sort of been talking about it with the staff, is a place where people can go and they can see snippets of all the presentations that we've had, and then link to the full presentations and link to the full meeting, so people could go get that. There could be sort of the discussion guide. There could be sort of a set of questions, I guess, sort of set up as a this is what we still have to dig into, but I mean, I think we need a document that captures some of this discussion. And to me, that's sort of part of what we want to do. We got to figure out how to do it in a way that's concise. We have to figure out a way to do it that is on the right questions. And part of what I'm still trying to feel out is where our consensus is.
Can I just clarify? Yeah. So the purpose of this document you're talking about is so that we can each go out into our communities virtually and collect input? Or is it so that we can show what we're doing, or a little of both?
So, okay, so there's two different things. And this is developmental, right? But my thought is that I guess ideally I'd say we adopt a resolution that is actually bigger than what we normally do, or that has an attachment that sort of lays out kind of our thinking on what we think are the strengths and what we think are the weaknesses, and what we as a group think why we think this should be better and different than it is, and then lay out what some of our options are, and the pros and cons, right? So that you're putting out there the basis of the discussion. That's sort of where I am.
To what end? So the end is that we're informing the public of our stance on this?
We are informing them of the set of questions that we're trying to gain input on, so that when we return in September and October, we adopt a set of recommendations.
So I really do applaud your interest in sharing as much information with the public as we can. I wonder, I like the idea of having a document that is available for the public as background, but if I could maybe reduce it to be too simple, here's what I think we're trying to do with the public. We're saying the star system exists, and this is what it is in case you don't know. And we had agreed to have 3 years of the star system and then have some changes. That was the outset. We're approaching year 3. COVID changed that a little bit, but we're approaching year 3, so it's time to think about changes. Here's what OSSI says they want to change. Here's what the state board is talking about. Rating versus dashboard. More changes to metrics or weights. I don't know. Add in 3 or 4 more things here from our document. We'd love to hear from you. And I think something that simple might need to be the sort of public facing piece of it with other documents behind it. I will just say, I am always surprised by the number of people who don't read the stuff you send out. Like, so, and I mean this like with my clients, with the public, with whatever. So I think if we can keep something super short and super simple like that, and then have a background document, that might be helpful. But again, I'm sure I've left something out of those couple points, but I think that's what we're trying to do with the public is here's why we're coming to you.
Yeah, I agree. And I basically like that set of things. I guess the only thing that I would add to it, and I agree, it makes it longer, and everybody, some people read and some people don't. I mean, that's sort of what discussions are, right? But it helps us, I think.
We should make a video. Seriously. I've heard print is dead. I've heard print is dead. That's what I hear. Everything has to be a video. So
except everybody is videoing in front of their bookshelves. So people have a lot of print, whether they read it or not, they own it.
that's true. Not me, but
one other piece, Jessica, that strikes me that we'd want, because it comes up every time we have a serious discussion, is this idea of the dilemmas. And that's, because none of these are, they're not black and white and yes and no. They're not. You get, there's pluses and minuses. So that's the main thing that I would add to your basic outline. But
and I say, like I understand the interest in kind of the public education, the educating the public aspect of it, and I think that's important. I think I agree that like what we release initially, like this is how we're outlining our work, is an important first step. I think maybe what we do in the interim is find forums in which we can, right, if we think it's necessary for folks to give us really like informed feedback, that we find ways to present that information to the public over the course of this process, that then right gives us the room and the spaces right to elicit that feedback, but also can double as kind of like this, right, this is the education, these are the dilemmas and the pluses and minuses we're thinking of. What do you think? I don't know if we will get that feedback if we try to outline all of that in like a white paper, pretty much like a document,
One thing I wonder about, maybe it's too cutesy, but I'm thinking about like how we would help make the plan for the public without creating a white paper. And maybe we could call them tensions, and we could say something like things we've heard that don't agree. Parents like the rating because they like knowing where their school stands. Parents don't like the rating because they don't like their school being called out as something less than they know and believe it to be, to the community. And then second tension we hear. More information is better. I want to know every detail possible. Please don't make it so complicated. I like having a quick at-glance set of information. Like, we could lay out some of the dilemmas, maybe the ones we think are most prescient, that we've heard conflicting feelings, conflicting opinions of the document, of the tool, and lay them out as tensions. And do so not just to educate the public on what we've heard, but to make clear, to Marcus's really nice way of putting it, that the best we can do is make it more perfect, but we're never going to get to an ideal system free of tensions. Like, tensions will remain. That's just a matter of who's going to feel like they got their tension resolved and who's going to feel like a new tension has arisen for them, because we're not going to make something perfect for everybody. I think that's going to, I think that's going to take another discussion, but I do wonder about like which ones we would pick out to say these tensions seem to be ones that are worth laying out as a dueling dialogue for the public.
In terms of format, we should give this all to Malayo and see what she thinks. Have her give us some recommendations or just come up with some things. But I was going to say, I feel like, and I shouldn't speak for Zach, I'm not speaking for him, but I feel like if he were here, I heard him kind of in my head saying, well, isn't the purpose of the the accountability system really to improve our schools, to make sure that we are meeting the needs of students. And so should we be focusing on the tensions? And I think I like your idea, Jessica, I actually do. But I did kind of hear his voice in my head. And I don't know if I disagree. Like, what do we want from families? I guess maybe, and I'm thinking out loud here, because I think there's value in finding out, or laying out the tensions and sort of getting input on those. And then I'm wondering if it makes more sense just to talk about, do you feel, ask for input on whether folks, how they see what they think the report card is actually doing?
Not the report card, the rating.
Sorry, the rating. I know, I just did what we just talked about.
Well, to that point, Emily, are people's opinions about the rating system, to what you just said about Zachary, wanting to focus on whether the school is improving or not, is getting more people's opinions on a rating system, does that have any reflection at all on whether a school is improving or not?
Right. So it goes back to,
If we're just going to go out and get people's opinions, we can go out and get a bunch of opinions that will disagree with each other, and some people will be louder than others. And it's a big difference between, if we're getting opinions for focusing on school improvement, we can differ on how that school improvement occurs, right? But at the end of the day, I don't want to spend a bunch of time just saying, oh, I don't like the rating system. Or I do like it. Maybe a lot of people say they do.
right.
Yeah, but
Yeah. I guess that's why I think it's worthwhile to put something out that sort of explains to the public what it is we're doing, what the questions are that we're raising. But it goes back to that essential question that Zach and Jessica raised of, like, why are we doing this? And is that what we want to convey to the public? Or, yeah, I guess I'm still on that.
But I'd also say, right, thinking about this public engagement, like we talked about earlier, right, as a necessary benchmark in like our ongoing work, I think is important, right? Some of the things that we're talking about right now, right, some of those tensions were tensions 3 years ago when we did public engagement around this work. I think what would be different, again, is having those conversations in the new light of seeing this executed, right, over the course of 3 years, and what is tangibly meant for schools and for families in their work to improve. And I think that's an important framing too.
And I also, I don't want to speak for Zach, but I think it's sort of, I mean, I think a lot of his idea is that whether it's a rating or a dashboard or whatever it is, it's connected to what you're going to do to make the improvements. And so that's both the conversation, but to Jessica's point, it gets us deeper into asking OSSE to take on things that they're probably even less likely to take on. So again, it puts forward a vision, which I think is good, because that's where you start, if you get people interested in something. But I think it's an issue. It's a tension, another tension.
I think too, one tension that we hadn't talked about until really today is asking families, I don't know how we frame it, but there is a real tension over what the future looks like, right? So I don't have a crystal ball, but let's say I had a crystal ball. One of the things I could imagine seeing in a crystal ball is the COVID crisis goes on through the winter, at least, and perhaps into next spring, making it difficult for states to hold testing again next spring, which means we've had 2 years with no data, which means we have no potential model that seems an effective measure of growth. So then that would make fundamental changes to how we thought about what do we know about our schools in the meantime? What does that mean for how we talk about schools? What does that mean for how, at that point, I hope and am fine saying this on the record. I hope we have a new Department of Education under a new administration. And what do they think about all this? And has Essa reauthorization begun by that point? Like, I think if we get to that point, we have so many possible untold futures. I do wonder if the public has any thoughts on, you know, what accountability looks like in their own sort of imaginations. And I think it would be rough to go at that with a big wide open question, but I think it's reasonable to raise it as a tension to say we're working on modifying a system, but we're also living in a time of great unknowns. These things are in tension.
Yeah. I think this brings us back to the beginning of our conversation where we were talking about indicators at this time. And that might be a really important question to ask, actually, because who better to ask than the folks who are going through this, right?
Correct.
And so I think that might be the best or one of the best questions to ask at this point. And to Jessica's point about testing, even if we do have testing in the spring, it won't really speak to the school year, right? Like we won't be able to say much about, I mean, the school year was disrupted, so it won't really speak to school quality. So we,
in addition, we didn't even have testing, so there's no baseline to compare it to.
Right.
Growth system, focus on growth is out the window because we can't even see if there was growth from year to year. And so then it is just proficiency that we have to assess. And I don't think anybody wants that. I don't think anyone on the board wants that.
Right. So it's maybe we really do need to think creatively about what it is that's most important now, right? Like who's getting are the groups that are most vulnerable getting the support that they need? You know, what practices are being put in place, you know, based on what we know on this very short, based on very short knowledge or a timeline of knowledge, you know, I don't know. I mean, I'm just making stuff up, right? So, but I think we do need to go there. What is OSCE talking about right now, actually, in terms of what they're going to do? Does anybody know?
What is OSCE talking about?
Yeah.
My understanding is that they're in the same place most state chiefs are, which is we don't know what we don't know because we don't even know what next year looks like yet.
So are they just not going to put out a report card?
That's what they said. I mean, that's what they
My
said.
understanding is they're going to put out a report card with whatever data is available, but they are not putting out a rating because of the lack of testing data and a lack of, I know the deck on attendance has a little bit, and I've got some questions about it, but like they're going to put out the report card, but not a star rating. And Alex is giving me the thumbs up that I have read accurately.
Yeah, and back to the conversation that you know I referenced before, that John Paul will put something out on, is we asked that question and their intention at the moment was to leave it up to LEAs. So I want to say one thing to what Emily said and then just try to wrap this up, maybe prepare us for tonight. But I mean, I think maybe the thing to, and a way to organize it even, is there really are sort of two sets of issues and they are related, which is kind of interesting, and they may happily inform each other, which is we have a set of issues right now about how do we know what's going on in our schools and what is working, right? And what the quality is or isn't. And under this special set of circumstances, and in the longer run, we have that set of questions, and we need to be oriented towards what is the longer term thing we're going to solve, but it can be informed by what we're learning now, that our situation now can open us up to thinking about what works now that can be part of something longer term. That was not well said, but the connection between the two, I think one can lead us to the other, and in some interesting ways. And to everybody's point, it's a way of sort of starting by recognizing that maybe in ways that nobody had perceived, you know, 6 months ago, a lot of this may end up being on the table. And so we're beginning those conversations.
Just the one thing I want to throw out there, Ruth. My first grad school advisor was a guy named Steve Selden, and he was a critical race theorist. And he used to talk about exogenous mitigating factors, basically all the stuff we can't control for inside institutions like schools. And I think the other thing I hope we are all aware of, just as we think about this, is that we just had 4 months of nothing but exogenous mitigating factors in the lives of our kids. And so any rating at all that attempts to capture what may happen next year, where some kids learn exclusively at home, some kids go A-Day, B-Day, maybe some kids go, I don't know whether LEAs will set their own schedules or not, if there'll be a citywide one, I have no idea yet. But if there is any expectation that at least some learning time is happening at home, we have just increased the number of exogenous mitigating factors tenfold, and we will then exacerbate inequality in every and any rating measure we seek to use. Because some kids will have very positive home experiences and some will have less positive home experiences. And I think that's going to happen all across the income spectrum, because you're going to have kids in happy, productive, loving homes, and you're going to have kids in abusive, dysfunctional, problematic homes all across the income spectrum. And I just worry that, again, any rating system is going to capture that, even if we are working with new and different data. And I hope and I trust that the folks on this board care a lot about equity, and so that we will be mindful and be vocal about that in whatever forms ratings may take. That we want to be clear that in those cases, it's going to be real hard to credit or blame schools in places where we've got a lot of learning happening in very different places.
Well, I mean, I appreciate that a lot. I think that also connects the near term and the long term, which is how do you make sure, and I think that's what we all sort of agree on, is how do we make sure these ratings are capturing something real and something useful and not just a million exogenous factors. So I appreciate that you're saying that, Jessica. All right, so going into tonight, so we have some time on the agenda. We also have a very packed agenda, but I think we want to hear, put out simply some of our ideas about the purpose. I'll try to capture some of this, but people should pitch in, and then try to hear others talk about it. And I mean, I'd be interested in hearing if there's other ideas about therefore what, but we don't have to go there. That had been my initial thought, was that people would go beyond the purpose, but I think we can find out. And that's what we got tonight. And then we do, and then I guess what I will do is sort of upset is kind of revise. And let me say the large document, it's my effort to try to keep track of what we're learning, trying to keep track of what we're learning, what we're thinking, where people come together and where they don't. And understanding that that's its purpose. And then hopefully we can draw from that or edit from that or select from that things that will then go into something else. One thing I will do is try to revise that based on the last public meeting we had, and then tonight, and then that will give us something more to sort of work off of as we sort of figure out how to move to this next document, this next stage. Jack?
I might have misheard. Earlier in the conversation, are these two different documents? Earlier in the conversation, this larger document was supposed to be for the public to use to see what the questions are. Is that a different document than the one you just talked about right now, which is this is a document for us to use internally to show where we're agreeing and where we're not?
Well, I guess I would say I see them sort of dynamically, Jack. I mean, the document we're now working on, it is sort of an internal document, although it's online, it's not that internal, that is meant to sort of capture what we're thinking, where we are, different ways that we're moving, what we're learning, and what the dilemmas or the tensions are. At some point, I mean, I would see us using that as the basis for something more limited that would become a public document. So,
in my line of work, a document has to have a specific purpose. And if you're trying to use the same document or report for two very different purposes, I think you come out with bad outcomes. And so I just make sure that we're cognizant of that.
All right, well, we are at 3:29. So with that, I will see you all in less than a couple of hours, and many of you I saw just a couple of hours ago. So go take naps, go talk to somebody else, and I'll see you soon. Bye, everybody.
All
Thanks
right,
for the
see y'all
conversation.
tonight.